wonder if you might then bring it back to what happens onshore in the U.S. and I guess repo market being maybe the main avenue of the onshore plumbing system, and how those two things correlate, right? The Eurodollar system is outside of the Fed's purview in law, but de facto it is quite impacted by the Fed's action. So can you tie those two things together and maybe reflect a little bit on how it happens onshore?
Well, I would, there's really a distinction between offshore and onshore. It isn't like there's a domestic dollar and then this offshore euro dollar. They're very much linked together. So it's really, in some ways, well, before 2007, it operated as a seamless whole because banks operating in it had various ways to input into the U.S. economy or the global economy or wherever they're going, whatever they're doing at any particular time, whether it's merchandise, trade, financing, whether it's financial flows, hot money, portfolio flows, whatever. You could have a bank in the Cayman Islands borrowing in the U.S. dollar repo market in Singapore, and then lending those funds to a bank in Illinois, for example. So it was essentially an integrated, seamless whole that operated all around the world, where because the vast majority of it operated outside the U.S., it really didn't leave a whole lot of space for the Federal Reserve or any central bank, other than maybe sentimental impacts. Because again, if you go back into the 1970s, where the central bankers threw up their hands and said, we can't even define money anymore, how would the Fed actually operate in that situation? And the answer is, surprising to most people, the Federal Reserve, they do only bank reserves. Bank reserves are not a form of money. They do interest rate targeting. Interest rate targeting is a form of psychology. And over the 80s, 90s, and into 2000s, what did the Fed do? They didn't even do bank reserves. Bank reserves were tiny fraction of what was taking place across the entire system. Instead, they did interest rate targeting, which was sold to the public as a means of making predictable movements in the economy through means nobody really knows. I mean, how does an interest rate targeting work? If Alan Greenspan lowers the federal funds rate, for example, which is basically all the Fed did during this period, how does that actually create a stimulus in the real economy? Nobody ever really stops and thinks about that, because you're not really supposed to. We're supposed to believe that the Fed is this all-powerful institution, when in reality, the monetary part of it is all in this offshore system it's not just offshore, it's everywhere, because that's what a reserve currency system actually is. It requires this currency capacity to be available in as many places as possible so that it can operate like a single global reserve currency. But again, that leaves very little room for the Fed outside of its psychological manipulation.